Our kith and kin in the occupied Syrian Golan renew their solidarity with their homeland and support for the Syrian Arab Army against the terrorist gangs. A unit of the Syrian Arab Army continues to uproot terrorism and to repulse the terrorists in Deir ez-Zor. Women and children tell the story of the savage terrorists who attacked them in their homes in the Latakia countryside.
هاي شو اسمك؟ مين رجعك من جوا عمو؟ مين جابكم من جوا من ايد الارهابيين؟ شو بتقول للجيش عمو؟ هاي تبوتي بوتي يا سلام
We are from the village of Barude, to the north of Latakia. We woke up in the early morning with the sound of the bullets of Al-Nusra front targeting our house. We escaped quickly in my brother's car to a nearby village. The car was hit. While I tried to save my kids, I was hit with a bullet. The terrorists of Al-Nusra front besieged us until we escaped through an olive orchard. We stayed for 6 days in the open until units of the Syrian Arab Army came and saved us.
We descended through the valley to escape from the terrorists. We stayed for 6 days with neither food nor drinking water. The Syrian army saved us after we spent 6 days in the open, as army terrorists of Al-Nusra Front attacked our village.
The children lost stories of beautiful times and woke up from their innocent childhood on the sound of bullets that surprised them with their families in the villages of Latakia. The criminal terrorists killed innocent women and unarmed children suddenly. However, the wakeful eyes of the Syrian Arab Army rushed to save the besieged families from the terrorists.
Syrians protest militants' occupation of Raqqa. Says in a northern city they've taken to the streets to protest against occupation of the provincial capital by foreign-backed militants. They chanted slogans against the Al-Qaeda-linked insurgent group, the Islamic State of Iraq, and it says here they demanded the release of hundreds of detained civilians by the militants. They also called on the insurgents to leave the city. Reports say hundreds of people have been kidnapped by the militants in the city, including Italian priest Father Paolo de Aglio, who was abducted in late July when he was on his way to meet the insurgent leaders to demand the release of protesters. Syrian rebels accused of sectarian murders. Hundreds of Alawite civilians have been killed, kidnapped, or have disappeared during the rebel offensive on Assad's heartland province of Latakia, local residents have reported. It says until now, 150 Alawites from the villages have been kidnapped. There are women and children among them. It says we have lost all contact with them. As one of the religious leaders. So you've heard about the 450 or so Kurds, and basically the Kurdish area of Syria, that were basically massacred. But we didn't hear about, it was kind of, well, I reported on it, but basically it was very little news blurb covered about the 50 Alawites that were basically executed at gunpoint by these rebels. Also, we never really heard much about the chemical weapons attack by the rebels as well. And as far as this goes, the UN going in there and inspecting it, well, the Syrian government wanted them to come and investigate it, but the only way that the UN would agree to this was if the government of Syria would allow them full access to basically Syria, and instead of just going to where the chemical attack happened, investigating it, and getting the hell out of the country. No, they wanted to basically put that offer, so they knew that they would refuse that, so they never investigated. It was very, very sneaky and stealth-like. Yet their own people, peacekeepers, have been kidnapped by these same rebels that the UK and France and the United States are supporting, you know, like this chemical attack, aiding them, training them. They don't do anything. Their own people get kidnapped and abducted and sold for ransom, and they don't even care. So it says here the UN has denied media reports chemical weapons experts have postponed their trip to Syria. The team is gathered in The Hague, and the logistics for the visit are being worked out with Syrian authorities. Russia submitted to the United Nations in July a study of soil samples taken from the site of a reported chemical attack by the Syrian opposition forces outside the northern city of Aleppo. They determined a nerve agent sarin was used and that it was not industrially manufactured. And you guys probably remember that article I covered from Press TV about the sarin gas containers that were caught when the border Syrian, I guess they were Syrian government border checks. They found these sarin gas containers on the rebels, so when they stopped them. Britain's foreign aid has fallen into the hands of Al-Qaeda, so this is a big shocker. You know, hold on to your seats. Almost £500,000 of British taxpayer-funded aid and equipment has fallen into the hands of the terrorists. The Department for International Development has admitted. But they're not talking about the Syrian operations. They're actually talking about Al-Shabaab confiscated their equipment from the contractors in multiple incidences over the last 3 months. Next up, revealed what the West has given Syrian rebels. Britain has so far handed over equipment worth £8 million to the terrorists, but can it help on the front line? The best case scenario for the rebels now, they say, would appear to be attempts at a land grab to create a position of strength before the much delayed ceasefire talks, Geneva II, take place in the autumn. The bulk of the arms that get into the opposition areas in Syria go to Islamist rebels courtesy of wealthy benefactors in the Gulf, especially Qatar. The last gift to the opposition, or terrorists, announced by William Hague last week is that almost £500,000 worth of counter-chemical warfare equipment is on standby. Here's a report. You can go in there and check it out. Pretty good, from Global Research. CIA gun running Qatar, Libya, and Syria. That's right, they're funding weapons from Libya. So, a report from CNN's Jake Taper has reintroduced Benghazi Gate to the U.S. media spotlight, claiming that dozens of CIA operatives were on the ground in Benghazi on the night of the attack, and that the CIA is going to great lengths to suppress the details about the whereabouts being released. The report alludes to the CIA applying surface-to-air missiles supplying these missiles from Benghazi to rebels in Syria. Over the weekend, I heard or watched some news reports, and the Syrian army basically took out about 3 or 4 different of these factions leaders. They're mostly Chechnyan, Libyan leaders, and you have a German militant leader killed in western Syria. So he's Abu Zaid al-Mani, who was a leader of the foreign-backed militant in Syria, has been killed in the country's province of Latakia. See, early on Sunday, Syrian army troops killed another commander of the foreign-sponsored militant group affiliated with Al-Qaeda, al-Shari. He was supposed to have been bin Laden of Syria. Over the past few days, Syrian forces have killed scores of these Takfiri militants, mostly foreign mercenaries. Then you have this. I've already covered it before, but you just type in these headlines, you can find them fairly easily. Saudi prince defects, brutality, oppression as government scared of Arab revolts. A major support of the opposition forces in Syria has increased crackdown on its own dissenters, where 30,000 activists reportedly in jail. In an interview with the prince defector, he explained what the monarchy fears most. So the kingdom has stepped up arrests and trials of peaceful dissidents and responded with force to demonstrations by citizens, says Human Rights Watch begins the country's profile on its website. Talking about prisoners, there's been killings. As for the external opposition, Saudi intelligence forces find these people abroad. There is no safety inside or outside the country. In Bahrain, ahead of Bahrain protests, a sweep against citizen journalists. Protesters are promising anti-government protests on August 14th, but ahead of it, the country appears to be moving to silence citizen journalists. So if where are the U.S. forces or the U.S. Regime changers, supporters of democracy, aiding the terrorists or opposition forces inside Saudi Arabia and Bahrain? Well, they don't exist. Saudi Arabia supports terrorism in Middle East, says analysts. It says Saudi Arabia can plays an active role in funding and supporting terrorism and extremism against democratic countries in the Middle East. So he says here that the foreign religious establishment of Saudi Arabia, as the staunchest ally of the U.S., adheres to the Wahhabi Salafi ideology, which is the most repressive, the most violent, and the most backward ideology. Gives religious legitimacy, religious incentive, and justification to the atrocities and also to the suicide bombings which are taking place in both Iraq and Syria. It's actually what that independent article admitted, talking about Britain or the UK supplying, a lot of money. I think it was half a million or £500 million pounds worth of aid. And they said the most effective weapon has been human bombs. Over 670 people have been killed in the holy month of Ramadan alone. This individual says it's reminiscent of the days of the 2006-2007 bloodshed. Saudi Arabia sponsoring violence in Iraq, says a former U.S. ambassador to Baghdad, Christopher Hill, says they're sponsoring violence in Iraq and represents the biggest challenge to the Iraqi government. And so far, the Iraqi government has not really been doing much in the way of whether they're helping or not helping the Syrian government. They kind of just been out there. They have, I think, mostly because they've been trying to deal with all of this Saudi-created destabilization, all these bombings, such as this. Around 80 killed, 200 wounded in a string of bombings in Iraq. This is from August 10th. Deadliest explosion took place in the capital, according to reports. So they have to deal, but then I saw this. The Iraqi Prime Minister announced security operations along Syria's border, wide-scale operations against terror groups. During the operations, terror groups and their hideouts will be targeted, said al-Maliki. Alright, moving on here. U.S. has serious concerns about Israel's settlements. I saw this headline is kind of, what's going on here, a little suspicious, because I saw this headline too. Russia calls Zionist settlement plan counterproductive. They criticize a counterproductive decision by the Zionist entity to invite bids to build nearly 1,200 settlements in the occupied West Bank and annex East Jerusalem on the eve of planned peace talks. So the U.S. has expressed serious concerns as well. Or as they say, our policy has not changed. State Department spokesman Jen Psaki told reporters, we don't accept the legitimacy of continuous settlement activity. This came 2 days before a planned release of Palestinian prisoners and ahead of new rounds of talks brokered by the U.S. between Israelis and Palestinians. Like I said before, this is their strategy, Israel's strategy, which is to create destabilization. They don't want peace. It doesn't help them. Egyptian protesters condemn Israeli attack. They've gathered near the Israeli embassy to condemn an attack carried out in the Sinai Peninsula. I believe it was the drone strikes. CIA warns of crisis as al-Qaeda prepares to pounce. This is from August 9th. I've pretty much already covered this. This is important, though, because it just shows you kind of a precedence being laid out just in case. Like the chemical weapons, if they're moved, if the Assad government moves them, if they fall in the hands of the terrorists, or if either of them use them, that's justification for a no-fly zone and possibly ground troops. So, it's one of those things like the UN not going in there investigating unless they can get access to the entire country. The war in Syria poses the greatest threat to the U.S. security because of the risk of the government falling and the country becoming a weapons-rich haven for al-Qaeda, like Libya. So, they don't care about that because they're arming the terrorists, and in Libya, like we said, they're arming terrorists to go up there to Syria and wreak havoc. And throughout North Africa and the Mideast. U.S. to reopen Mideast embassies except in Yemen on Sunday. They would reopen all of the embassies that shut this week except the one in Yemen after reassessing the al-Qaeda threat. U.S. drones kill more than 30 in Yemen. A school was targeted in one attack. In fewer than 2 weeks, Hellfire missiles launched by the U.S. drones have killed at least 31 people in Yemen. At least 14 of the victims were believed by Obama, the launcher-in-chief, to be al-Qaeda militants. Of course, like always, on the heels of reports of the foiling of a plot purportedly hatched by the Yemeni-based branch of alleged terrorist organizations. That gave legitimacy to these drone strikes. U.S. drone, and of course they had to, just to make it even further legitimized, they had to put this whole embassy charade on. U.S. drones pound Yemen, but targets aren't all militants. So here they say they have a number of 49 killed in Yemen. Indeed, of all the U.S. strikes, the administration was only willing to say that at least 14 of the slain were al-Qaeda militants. At least 35 others who the locals say are just random civilians killed in the strikes that are hitting civilian areas. So why are they closing embassies, and why is an al-Qaeda threat being put out by the West? Well, because backlash is growing in intensity as the strikes do. Found a similar trend to anti-U.S. sentiment. The strikes fueled across Pakistan. Tunisian army strikes Islamists on border with Algeria. This is important to keep an eye on as far as destabilization in North Africa, because you have it in Egypt and that. Tunisia's army on Monday bombarded jihadist positions in rugged mountain range and near the Algerian border. Also because Tunisia is having issues with the Western-backed government there and protesting, kind of like an Arab summer. They want regime change. Spanish Coast Guard picks up 59 immigrants off Gibraltar. Now look at how close it is to Morocco. Many immigrants of sub-Saharan African origin tried to reach Spain from Morocco, either by sea or whatever, almost 196 over the weekend. I find it kind of interesting because then you have this all of a sudden. Britain warns of legal actions as warships head to Gibraltar. So British warships head to the Mediterraneans. They said they warned Spain yesterday might take legal action to try to force Madrid to abandon tighter controls at the border. So it says here, when what it called an unprecedented step against the European ally. But lastly, you have Gulf dictatorships such as Bahrain luring the UK to go basically stage in the Suez Canal once more, take on a permanent role. Thank you.